Well, Cheng Lei, welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast.
Thanks, Dan.
Uh, People who don't know you are probably very few these days, but uh, if someone wants to understand your story in a nutshell, what's the best way of explaining who you are and how you rose to prominence?
I'm a Chinese Australian journalist. I went to China to use my bilingual skills at the end of 2000, worked in Asia for almost 20 years for foreign and Chinese media. And at the tensest point in Australia-China relations, I was surveilled and then eventually arrested on suspicion of espionage in year 2020 during the COVID outbreak. And I think the best explanation for my arrest and subsequent punishment was retaliation against Australia unilaterally calling for an investigation into the source of COVID.
Yeah, and you were happily released in the end. That was which is it's a
Very
good thing. And
happy.
you're now working for Sky
Thanks to
News.
sustained diplomatic efforts from Australia.
Yeah, amongst other things. Um, I am interested in your media career. How did you originally get the job at CCTV in China?
I was an accountant in Australia, and when I went to China, I was working as a business analyst for a Sino-Australian joint venture in logistics in eastern China's Shandong province. And that was a huge mistake on the part of Toll Holdings, or their subsidiary at the time, Finamores, and it was a very naive and poorly judged investment, which they pulled out of after a year. And I was looking around for other China jobs because I was really fascinated by the dramatic change going on in the country. And I went for an interview at CCTV 9, the English arm. It was very, very, very early days for that channel. CCTV had been around for 20 years by then, but to have an English channel, they needed all the help they could get. And they really appreciated that not only was I bilingual, but I had the business experience. So I interned on the show in the first month, became a reporter in the second month, and in the third month, they gave me a 15-minute weekly show called Financial Review to host. It was a very steep learning curve, but I really enjoyed the fast pace and um, I'm a curious person, very passionate, so it was much more suitable to me than accounting or business analysis.
Was it competitive? Because I would have thought these days being a newsreader on an English or a Chinese channel would be a highly sought after role. And even at that stage in those early days, there would have been people, aching to get that type of, exposure
As
and prominence in a glamorous industry. It wasn't what helped you get it.
Well, as with anything, you have to be in the right place at the right time and know the right people. Luckily for me, I had my former mother-in-law had a contact at CCTV 9 because she was an English professor. So
Mm.
my resume had all the right things. I had the business degree, excellent grades. I had business experience, CPA. I was an accredited NATI translator between Chinese and English. So at the interview, I was asked to do a voiceover. And in fact, during university, I had done a number of voice recordings for Chinese education materials, in which you read English and Chinese materials. And I starred in Queensland Department of Education's education videos for kids learning Chinese. So I had a bit of on-screen experience, and at the time, China was about to join the WTO. The buzzword was internationalization or globalization, and they really wanted to work with people who had overseas experience, and everything that was foreign was seen as positive, progressive, something to learn from. Not quite so today.
No, I started professionally working in China in 2000, and I do have to pinch
Oh,
myself
thank God.
sometimes. Basically, yeah, I was in Shanghai, but you were in Beijing, I guess. But I do that. I have to pinch myself sometime contrasting the mood in early 2000 with the mood today, because it is chalk and cheese in terms of optimism. The attitude of the business people is also very different to then compared to now. Um,
Yep.
let's get a little bit more on the media side. You've now worked in both Chinese and Western media companies, including
Yes.
CNBC in China and now Sky News in Australia. How different are they in practice? What would you say are the biggest differences on a day to day basis?
Well, there's also a lot of difference between Western media in China and operating in China and Western media operating here, for example.
Mm,
Here, it's totally free.
mm,
We can just stick a microphone in the prime minister's face when he has a press event. It's just a given. There will be Q&A. But
mm,
no matter if you're a Western or Chinese journalist, that is that is not the way it works in China. There is very little media access for officials, and when there is, it's highly scripted. I mean, of course, you'll still take it, but I mean, to date, Xi hasn't done any TV interviews, and I think when he first came to power, there was one scripted interview with a Dutch outfit, but it may as well have been, a China daily piece. It
mm,
said nothing. And I really liked, um, speaking to entrepreneurs in China or the about to retire officials in China, because it's only then that they could be a bit more candid, and not be in fear all the time. Of course, after she came to power, the fear for everyone went up several notches. So there's your interviewee's attitude. The studio guest booker is different. Here, we just try to find the sources who are closest to the stories. But there, they have to vet the guest for their political stance, see if they've said anything that's, pro Tibet independence or whatever, their four T's and FX, three T's Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen, Falun Gong, Xinjiang, and now Hong Kong. So, if you're not a vocal proponent of anti-CCP views, then you might get on. And in at CGTN or its predecessor CCTV News, there were always political polishers. So I was a so-called foreign expert in that I could edit the scripts before it went to air, not just for me, but for other reporters and other shows. And then it would go to a political polisher who's usually a seasoned China Daily editor slash, longtime reporter who knows that when you say, 12 countries and then the list includes Hong Kong, you have to change it to 12 countries and regions. And if you don't say North Korea, you say DPRK, stuff that people in the West wouldn't notice, but, that's about as far as, and also if you say Chinese mainland, it's okay, but if you say mainland China, it denotes there's another China, and that would be changed. So these minor differences that could lead to political repercussions that Westerners wouldn't even notice.
yeah. But I believe I've seen footage of you at the time you were an anchor for CC, either CNBC or the CCTV equivalent, um, saying that there's quite a lot of freedom in your discussions that you had in the business community, and but clearly, eventually, you bumped up against something which you weren't expecting. W-
And that's for
Why
a
were
number of reasons.
yeah? Why were you detained exactly? What's your best understanding of both the pretext for why it was done and also the underlying motives at play?
I know the surveillance started on the 23rd of April, which is a few days after our then Foreign Minister Maurice Payne unilaterally calling for an independent investigation into the source of COVID. and that there were other Australians also surveilled. So that's a fact. I know that I had been posting on Facebook, cri- articles and my personal observations critical of China's handling of COVID. I was also asking everyone that I came to know about the source of COVID, whether they were medical experts or diplomats. I know that I had just done a pilot for a show which is about dining and cooking with ambassadors. And so for that, I was going to a lot of embassies. And earlier this year in Beijing's number two court, when editor and also journalist Dong Yuyu's case went to trial, the judge said, "Don't you know that all Japanese diplomats are spies?" So that common view in the Chinese judiciary and security apparatus may have led to extra suspicion. I know that when they first arrested me, it's highly likely they thought that I was a spy because they asked me things like, um, "You're bilingual. Did ASIO recruit you?" And also their smear campaign, which continues to this day, makes out that I worked for both the US and Australian security organizations. And I would like to be paid now, thank you, ASIO and CIA.
Yeah.
Um, Australia had ousted these Xinhua journalists as spies. There's could be retaliation against that too. And then the questioning of Australian media peers in China. Mike Smith and Bill Birtles had to flee the country because they were questioned and intimidated by the Ministry of State Security. What was all that about? Um,
Mm.
could they have somehow had this conspiracy theory that okay, another angle is China's deputy head of police, Sun Lijun, was educated at the University of New South Wales, has family in Sydney, and could it be that we intercepted some intelligence because he was the Wuhan cleanup man? Um, and therefore, that gave us the balls to ask for the unilateral investigation into the source of COVID. And China thought that maybe he had told me, maybe there was some information sharing. I remember this bizarre meeting with my lawyer, which were very rare and very precious. And he asked me if I had had a fling with Sun Lijun. It was the most bizarre thing I'd ever heard. I didn't know the person. And why that sort of rumor was out, I mean, so much in China is top secret and classified. We may have to wait for decades before or if ever, the truth comes out.
But the specifics were that you released some information in advance of the designated,
Yeah, the embargo time. Yes,
embargo.
that
Yeah.
was the time, but that was because they raided my apartment. They had found this document because they took a lot of papers, they took all my electronics, got all the passwords, they went through all of my texts, and that piece of paper was from May 22nd. So when they arrested me, it was August, and they, honed in on the fact that it was the Premier's work report, which is one of the few documents in China that has, sort of, important that comes out of the rubber stamp, um, event known as the Two Sessions. So, basically at 9 o'clock that day, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang would have read out the whole document,
Mm,
and I had texted my friend at Bloomberg, a Chinese national,
mm,
who, we were always sharing information and helping each other out when we were out reporting, etc. So, um, and we had a lot of, common contacts.
mm,
So I told her that, the 8 words, no growth target, GDP, 9 million jobs target, and apparently the
mm,
embargo time was 7:30. I did not know this, and they, questioned my, then colleague, who I didn't even know because I was in the makeup chair, and she just came, from my back and handed me this report. And in court, I heard her testimony, which was that she told me it was a classified document, which is total bollocks because she did not say that to me, and then I was flipping through the document, and then I was showing it to, the guests who were from the outside who were in the room. So, that is how they made this whole case. But if it
mm,
wasn't for that, and the embargo time wasn't, the document that says the embargo was 7:30 AM, the
mm,
that document was only made up a year later when the prosecutor tossed the case back to the case officers and said, "You need evidence." And so they went to the classifications bureau and got this document.
mm.
So, I only saw my lawyer 10 months later. The first time the prosecutor saw my lawyer, he said, "Cheng Lei's case is a joke." But then the second time, he pointed upwards and implied
Yeah, right.
that higher ups want her punished.
Mm.
So, um, it could have been anything. Could have been, "Why did you call Dan Ryan? Why did you speak to Metcon?" Um,
Yeah. Yeah. So do you think but for the fact that there was this, paranoia, and additional paranoia and increasingly defensiveness around the time of COVID because of the requests from Australia to get to the bottom of where the COVID came from, that they wouldn't have made a big deal out of this, what seems like an actually kind of inconsequential, early release of some information. Is that right?
yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. It
Yeah.
was not for this itself.
Mm. Yeah. Do you think how have your views on the Chinese government changed over the years? Again, watching some earlier footage, I think you were quite kind of confident that you'd be able to navigate the shoals of the sensitive topics and nevertheless be able to, um, in a way that I think you said, people who didn't have the same level of understanding about Chinese culture and the political system wouldn't necessarily be able to. But clearly, even with your knowledge, you still got tripped up. So is that because of the change in China during that time, or is it sort of just an overconfidence that other people like Jack Ma also sort of express similar types of things that, I can do my entrepreneurialism because I know what to avoid and I can, but in the end, he also similarly came a cropper as it
Yeah.
was.
Well, everything is safe until it isn't.
Yeah.
Um, I think I was overconfident because I had worked there for a long time. I knew a lot of people and knew their real attitudes. And I thought that what I was doing was quite, it was business. But under Xi's China, state security now covers 16 sectors, everything from culture to media to, of course, um, the economy. So now I know when they want to, they can say anything is state security related and then do quite a lot to you that
Mm,
I didn't expect. So a lot of naivety. There was the time China was, I think, still is super, super sensitive about COVID, and I think we can guess why. And um, also, after Trump came to power, I think China tightened even more. It's sort of like an animal that gets attacked and then he just bristles, and um, that's how it was in our jobs, because prior to, say 2015, 2014, I think people were m more open, they could be more critical, and the whole atmosphere was quite, anything goes, but, that quickly changed, or now it seems that it was quick, but at the time, it was gradual. And
mm,
then when the US-China trade war started, we noticed, everything was politicized, and it was, and it's now still is a very, very difficult area to navigate. I was
mm,
speaking to Glasgow from The Australian about his challenges reporting on the ground. And I would love to speak to other reporters who are about to go to China,
mm,
just to, let them know these are the things to expect and don't be fooled by this, and what to look out for
mm, yeah.
to do as good a job as you can, but stay safe.
Mm. There is debate about how much of the change can be attributed to Xi Jinping. In some ways, I think it's kind of convenient for policymakers in the West to say, "Oh, our policy was fine regarding China with engagement and everything else, but oh, Xi came along, and well, how are we to know that this was going to happen?" And I also like to point out to people that China wasn't though China wasn't locking up dissidents or cracking down on Tibet or firing missiles at Taiwan or claiming parts of the South China Sea before Xi came to power, right? Um, so how much? What do you think? How much is the change, to the extent there has been a change, um, Xi's responsibility?
I think the personal worship is totally Xi.
Mm,
Um, it's only an insecure emperor who would make everyone around him, because in China you always try to guess what the number one wants, right?
mm,
And if the number one wants this, then you deliver that. And
mm,
the amount of Xi Jinping thought schools, the amount of his, CCTV makes up shows about his sayings, um, how many of his speeches have been turned into books in over 100 languages. I mean, and
mm,
that makes news every day. That is Xi all over. And with that sort of insecurity, and of course at the start it was still a little bit of Xi and Li rivalry that
mm,
everyone in Beijing was gossiping about, but that was about around 2014. But you could see things change, and then all the Xi loyals came to power, and then the brown nosing just got worse and worse, and so all the jokes about Cultural Revolution 2.0 about Western Korea all
mm.
came out, and here we are in 2025. And
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to say is you're absolutely right. China was definitely doing all those things before, but after she came to power, they got worse, and in many ways, people began to lose hope that there could be reform as well as the bad things happening.
Mm,
I think if the general direction is towards change, or if change is still possible, people are more optimistic. But what happened in the past 10 or 13 years has shut all that hope down.
mm. I mean, one of Xi's rivals it was Bo Xilai, right? He was originally making moves internally to try to become the top dog, and he was also promoting red culture and a certain cult of personality, I suppose. But he famously is now in prison in Beijing still. Um, it sort of inevitable that the structural forces in China would require a type of strong man, whether because I remember meeting Bo Xilai in Beijing, and he seemed quite, you know, reasonable as
Charming.
far as yeah, charming, like a Taiwanese businessman in some ways. And he didn't seem all that bad, well, on the face of it. But there was relief when he wasn't given the top job and Xi Jinping came to power. It's like, okay, we know he's a bit more sensible. At least we're not going to get this type of, I don't know, new Mao revolutionary fervor, right?
I don't know that it always takes a strong man.
Mm,
Hu Jintao isn't known as a strong man,
mm,
um, but I'm always trying to grapple with the question, if you can blame the government, you can blame a leader, but do you blame the people?
mm,
Or, do the people deserve the government that they get or they have? And
mm.
right now, what worries me is that there are so many vested interest holders Because sometimes I get questions like, "Do you think there will be enough dissent that it will eventually boil over into some sort of rebellion?" And what I see now is, one, technology enabling far more repression and silencing, and then two, the vested interest holders um, still preferring the status quo because they are still benefiting, relatively speaking, from that. And I'm
mm,
talking about the party members,
mm,
those in the system.
yeah,
And that's
yeah,
what the whole pivot has done, right? So
mm,
Xi's pivot is state in, private out,
mm,
or retreat.
mm. You've interviewed a lot of Western businessmen who traveled to China over the years. Which of those have most impressed you about their genuine knowledge about the place, as opposed to those who I've met a lot of, who really haven't got much of a clue but think they do?
I don't think CEOs who fly in a few times or once a year
Mm,
can really get China.
mm,
Even people who live there for years may not get China because, for example, on X, you have all these Caucasian China cheerleaders who say,
mm,
"It's great, China's safe for me."
mm,
And I look at them, "Hello, you're white." It certainly helps to be white in China because they are treated better, and
mm,
they're quite blatantly, I guess they feel this need, wherever that comes from, this need to address the imbalance in reporting on China versus
mm,
so-called Western mainstream media. Um, but they don't present the hidden parts of China. Um, oh God, I've interviewed so many CEOs. I don't think
Pick
anyone
up,
of
yeah.
them would, maybe when if they have, for example, the Volkswagen, but then, they change CEOs every few
Mm,
years. It's more the academics who will keep on observing. China is so complex, contradictory, and changes so fast that maybe you can say somebody gets China now, but will they get China in a few years, or do they understand China 20 years ago, is a question mark. But,
mm,
I think that's why we need more, um, people to know about China. And I was thinking about this, moral quandary that we have about China.
mm,
Um, because if we buy their products, if we, go over there to study, then are we propping up the regime? Are we supporting them? Are we using our actions to somehow um, you know, become pro CCP or pro communism.
mm,
But then, but then you kind of look at what they do. They send their officials overseas. I mean, um, if I remember correctly, their defense spokesperson studied at the University of Birmingham. They have so many officials who have studied abroad, who know English, so many entrepreneurs, and all of the elites send their kids to Western countries to study no matter
mm,
what their line is
mm,
about, um, you know, the 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 evils of Western society.
mm,
And, the average observer in China often points out this hypocrisy, that they talk up China and then they all want their families to have Western citizenship and they want their properties to be in Western countries. So,
mm,
should we not, also be quite free in choosing to study in China, and we can we can have an influence. I was also thinking of, a funny lack of reciprocity. Can you imagine if we tried to round up Labour supporters in China before Albo's visit?
mm.
Or if
Ridiculous.
if the Australian ambassador in Beijing gave a talk to local students about how Labor Party is the best party in the world,
Oh,
which has happened in Canberra recently. It's
yeah.
just
Yeah, no,
so
be
weird.
mind-blowing. It's an asymmetrical engagement, right? I mean, Xi Jinping can send his daughter to Harvard, but I don't
Yeah,
think he actually really fears her being indoctrinated with a love of freedom in at Harvard. I mean, it probably says a lot about Harvard that isn't actually a real risk that he thinks he faces. And yet, if you're sending journalists, a businessman to China, there is the risk of leverage that will be applied to them at the very least to toe
yeah,
the
yeah,
party
that's
line.
right, 'cause we can't do
And
arbitrary detention.
that's right. And even if they're not sort of they don't being explicitly sort of threatened or because their money comes from there, the customer is always right, and the customer just happens to be Beijing. So that tends to be the kind of implicit attitude that's adopted by many in the business world in Australia. But it's hard to get that balance right. It's hard. You can't just not sell to China. I really do recognize that. Speaking of CEOs, we now have a CEO in the White House. Trump, former CEO of Trump Corporation. What do you make of the Trump administration and its handling of China?
It's, um I don't know if this unexpected or erratic sort of approach is better, but I know that the playing by, clean rules didn't really get the West that far.
Mm,
So China was able to become more powerful became before it became better at the same time, if you know what I mean, like morally better. Um, and it used to be that the international community's pressure accelerated democratic change in China. But then once the economy got to a certain point and weaponized its markets, then there was a lot of silencing and self censoring.
mm,
And what Trump does is throw out the rule book. And in a way, I think that could be effective. But as you say, the fact that he's a CEO means it's not going to move the dial towards a better world necessarily, a fairer world. I don't like the way he speaks to reporters. I don't like that when we first came to Australia, and I was 10. My dad was a visiting scholar at Monash, and he loves the US. He would always say, "This is what makes America great." And in fact, the whole family was going to go to Utah because his old professor was wanted him to study there or to do research there. But the fact that it could attract the brightest talents from around the world, especially in science, and allow um, such freedom in research, in thinking, and for a long time, I think my dad was a Trump supporter just because he felt he could stand up to China. We don't talk about Trump and Xi, anymore. In fact, talking to my dad can be very challenging. He's quite stubborn and domineering. Um, but, he I don't know that this is because we've seen the to and fro.
mm,
1 minute he's a great man, the next minute we've got tariffs, and in a way, the shutting, the door on China might accelerate, their, I guess, patriotism and this sort of everyone is against us. We must innovate on our own.
mm,
Um, um, I have no no answers for this,
Mm,
and I certainly don't like legitimizing bad behavior or throwing out, um, rules and laws,
mm,
but
yeah.
what's the alternative? We also have
It's
to yeah.
yeah, it's certainly a new approach and shaken things up, and I imagine people in Beijing kind of find it infuriating in some ways because they were used to they like order and predictability, and that's what they sort of got over the last, well, at least since 2000, I think. Um, I think there's a tendency in the US of late not to place as much emphasis on human rights in China as they might have done under the, say, George W. Bush administration. It kind of wavered off a bit under Obama, where he had functions at the White House but didn't really mention um, human rights, Nobel Prize winners that were locked up. And under the Trump administration as well, it hasn't seemed to have the same priority. How central should human rights be in Western countries' relationship with China?
Well, the US used to be known in Chinese as the beacon country, um, because you could look up to it, and it was a model of, um, I guess, protecting human rights. And now in China, there's a great deal of cynicism, and around the world, given what's happened in the past few years. And I hate that people think because the US is has let its human rights standards slip, that somehow that makes China the model student to emulate. You I always say you can criticize both, and you should criticize proportionately. You should look at, and the thing is, I again come back to this abyss of, um, asymmetry, right? What we know about China, what China hides is or what we don't know about China, I should say, is so vast that and yet everything in the US, in the West, it's all open. So you can say, "This is no good, that's no good, blah, blah." But what can you say about China? How can you even criticize it properly without knowing what it's hiding? And we know it hides a lot,
Mm.
um, just from my personal experience.
Yeah. You were, for a time, a locked up Chinese dissident. There are other people at the moment. One prominent case who I have a bit of a
Dr.
connection
Yang.
to is, well, Dr. Yang, but also Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. Um, what would you say are successful tactics, if any, that Western governments can use to help secure the release of these types of people?
I think China would be very, very afraid to release someone like Jimmy Lai because of his influence. Um, Whereas I think um, I was seen as, oh, sure, I have, since coming out, I have made more trouble for them than they predicted or than they would like. But I am a journalist, but he is a former publisher, a billionaire tycoon. Um, and I think the way that my release was, the way that my family and friends, especially my former partner Nick, advocated for my release was to ask for compassion. And um, that suits China because it likes to be in a place of power and control. So if I'm the all powerful emperor, and if I lift my finger and let this little animal go, and I am seen as benevolent, that works, um, that props up my psyche.
Mm,
But I think if I have, a dragon or, a beast, that I have locked up and it's going to come back and bite a big chunk out of me,
mm.
I'm I mean, we do all we can to ask for better treatment and for, medical bail for Jimmy Lai, but you also have to understand the depth of their fear. Um, if they're so afraid of someone like me that, the smear campaign and then trying to shut down my talks and so on, can you imagine how much they fear someone like Jimmy? Um,
Yeah. Who is a incredibly nice and principled person. In fact, I like to say he's probably the nicest tycoon you'll ever meet, in some
exactly.
ways. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Hey, a few final questions. Gonna time is short. Uh,
Yeah.
we still earn a lot of money from China selling iron ore and other produce to them.
No, 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 no,
Uh,
no, 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 no. We sell, we both benefit from this,
sure.
and I think we should yeah, um, we somehow feel a lot of guilt about selling our products,
Mm.
but I don't think we should. I
Oh,
think
I don't.
that
Yeah, because I it's a two-way street. Oh, I guess that I was
yeah,
trying to make it interested in a different point. I mean, BHP or Rio, let's choose a whatever company. Um, they sponsor, Chinese understanding type of things at Beijing University, but they would never um, establish or sponsor I don't know, symposium or institute for the religious freedom in China, right? Or free speech in China, or journalistic integrity in China, right? They just know that that's not something you would never do, and yet it would be a nice sort of check or balance or to show that they can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? Because
wouldn't we love that?
yeah, that's right. I mean, it's very hard to get this relationship right, but I do think that you have to be able to show that you have a concern for things other than simply material benefit, because otherwise you lose your credibility with the Australian public, the Western public, and ultimately, your corporate values aren't quite what they seem. So, I mean, what have you had much engagement with Australian corporates, and have they been sympathetic to you or to your message?
I've done some corporate speaking gigs,
Mm,
not the ones you talk about. I think I'm probably a feared personality in the, very China heavy corporate world, um, because I'm seen as a symbol of anti-CCP, of division and of disengagement, and I find that sad and petty. I
mm,
think that we should be able to say tough things and, do it the right way. We can
yeah,
have, um, honest conversations in private, and we can put our case forward. This is who we are. This is how Australians feel, and we as much as we like the trade relationship and we have personal friendships, we also want to help you. I know that sounds really condescending, so maybe that's not the right wording, but I think in the past few decades, the West has helped China improve. And a recent example, I mean, I can't prove that this is because of things I've done or things other NGOs have done, but in October, China came out with amendments to the RSDL. Um, I call it torture, but China calls it something else. And you may know it's residential surveillance at a designated location, which is basically disappearing someone, extreme isolation and intimidation, and for the Chinese locals, a lot of physical torture as well. And under Xi, the usage has gone up exponentially. And the Sky News documentary, in which RSDL was a big portion because we made a replica set of the cell, that came out in May. There have been books published by Safeguard Defenders, a great NGO, started up by somebody who went through RSDL.
mm,
And I hope everyone who's gone through RSDL, like me, is free enough to talk about it. And
mm,
if what any of what we've done has created enough influence that it's resulted in this amendment, which basically says you cannot use it willy-nilly, you have to have a lot more checks and balances, which is a step in the right direction, then that proves that the external criticism does help. It
mm,
helps the Chinese, people. It helps in a way, it helps the Chinese regime, but,
mm,
um, it's not that communism itself or the CCP are evil monsters. It
mm,
is the things they do, and if they could change the way they do things, then, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I don't care what you call a party or a regime. I just
mm,
like to see people not suffer.
mm. Yeah, I think China is. I always say to China is actually far more influenced by the West, or influenceable by the West than is commonly appreciated. I mean, back in the day, two
Absolutely. They
thousand.
care a lot about
Yeah,
yeah,
in
about
those
bad press.
heady times of 2000, Thomas Friedman was writing the China Dream, and then the Chinese were talking about the China Dream, and then the Trump was getting aggressive on Twitter, and then we got these wolf warrior, diplomats doing sort of aping that as well. Like they tend to sort of, yeah, like I said, be far more influenced by the West than is commonly appreciated. Final question, Ale, what are you doing now? You're doing Sky News, but what's the focus of your professional life and your endeavors? What are you hoping to achieve over the next 5 to 10 years?
I'd like to see the abolition of RSDL, so I will continue to talk about that. I'd like to see people understand China better, and it's hard to do, but so worthwhile. So I'm encouraging people to know more about China, and I'd like to see more acceptance. And I said this at this Brisbane dialogue, the diaspora. We must protect our diaspora from CCP influence, because if we don't accept them, respect them, um, and then they feel alienated, then it's very comforting to turn to the bosoms of the motherland.
Yeah, well, look, strength to your hand. It's a pleasure to reconnect. We first met, like I said, tell people 7 years ago in Beijing,
Yeah.
and it was a very different world. And I would not have expected in a million years for you to have gone through the ordeal that you did and to come out the other side. But you're an incredibly valuable contribution to the um, landscape in China-Australia relations here.
Yeah,
And
another thing I'd like to see is, more unity in
mm,
Australia when it comes to China.
yeah,
Um, I think China is very united in
mm,
their narrative and rhetoric, and we, have a lot of, I guess, internal bashing that, we say something and then Paul Keating says another. I mean,
yeah.
yes, it is freedom, but, I guess what mean is not that we should speak with one voice, but we should all try to, um, stand up for this is gonna sound so crazy cliche, Australian values,
Mm,
and that is definitely freedom, human rights, our openness, our compassion and kindness,
mm.
um, and our fairness.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't want to create a harmonious society where everyone agrees like in China, but
That's
but
fake.
but
Yeah.
but we do have our own red lines, as well here, which people should should all recognise. A pleasure to chat to you again, Lei. I'll pop this online. I'll cut out the business about stand up if I can, and look forward to keeping in touch in future. Have a
Thanks a lot,
lovely
Dan.
day. Cheers, mate.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. Bye bye.